All right. So, good evening, Emma. We're talking mainly about Mary Carr this evening, but I'm sure we'll get to talk about other bits and pieces too. But I thought, just for the benefit of my listeners and maybe your listeners, I don't know, who haven't heard of you or don't know who you are, how would you introduce yourself?
I am a Mary Carr fanatic. I'm currently writing a book for Pen and Sword Books, which is a non-fiction book on her life, and I've just published a novel of her life. I've been researching her for about the last 4 years, and I discovered her back in 2021 when I was writing a fictional novel, and I was looking for a real person for my fictional character to interact with. That book's coming out with a little indie press called Holland Press this month. And I have another title published with them as well, which came out in February. So I've been writing now for about 5 years, and it just so happens that all my books seem to be coming out this year. So it's been a bit of a crazy time and a bit of an exciting year. So yeah, I'm. People might not have heard of me because I am quite a new writer, but I've been looking at Mary Carr now since about 2021.
Okay, so that's so cool. So we do have a list of questions here, but I'm immediately going to go off piste and tell you a little bit about me. So because it's actually almost exactly the same. So in I heard from Pen and Sword in September 2021, and they just wanted a book about something. We were talking about gangs generally, and of course, the first thing I thought of was Peaky Blinders. That was the thing. I'm just looking at the book there. That was the thing that was on everybody's minds at the time. I think the last series was coming out, but I knew there was a film,
Yeah.
and I knew Stephen Knight was doing amazing things. So I put a proposal together, and we did that. But the funny thing was that about 4 months or 6 months into that, I found Mary Carr and Alice Diamond, and they became like half the book, and the best half, I have to say. So that was exactly the same year, but we've come at this in very different ways. So the first real question is, could you tell me a little bit about your writing and the historical background? What was it that helped you choose the Victorian period?
So I I used to work at a place called Bliss Hill Victorian Town. So it's part of the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust, and there are about 9 sites around Shropshire. And Bliss Hill Victorian Town is this lovely Victorian town. You sort of, when you work there, you go in, you dress as a Victorian, you give talks about Victorian life, and although I worked there for about 7 years, and before then I'd volunteered there. And as a teenager, I volunteered there, and as a child, my parents used to take me in there all the time. So this Victorian town was kind of like my second home almost, and that's had a massive influence really on my time period, because it's somewhere that I feel quite at home, in the Victorian period. And so when I started writing, sort of seriously back in 2020, um, I I just sort of naturally just fell into the Victorian period. So my first
Mm.
book was is called The Prendergast Watch, and that was published in February by Holland Press. Um, and it was a sort of fairly unplanned book. It was I was a bit of a pantster with that one, so I was sort of making it up as I went along. But it was very obvious straight from the start that it would be Victorian, and it would be very Victorian led. And it's I wouldn't say I'm trapped there, because trapped's the wrong word. I think I'm just
Mm.
sort of I'm lodged there. I'm kind of, yeah,
Lodging.
I'm stuck in there now because it's kind of where I feel home, and sort of I can't find my way out, and I don't know if I want to find my way out. It's an amazing time period, isn't it? It's really close. It's almost as close, so close we could
Mm.
touch it, but it's almost incredibly removed from us at the same time. So there's a lot of familiar things, but there's a lot of things that are just mind-bogglingly sort of, when you think about the medicines of the time and what the people were taking, and it just seems incredible now that why would you put that into yourself? But so it's just this incredible time that's, yeah, and it's very traceable. That You've got so many records about it as well.
Yeah.
It just seems perfect to me for writing and for historical research, because although I'm a writer, I've always loved the research side of things as well. And I think the Victorian era is so it's everything's documented. Not everything, but there's so many documents out there that you can just kind of lay your hands on it if you know where to look, and it's just perfect for me, really.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously, I can see you. Other people can't see you, but it's pretty obvious how excited you are about that period. Um, and I'm going to reflect on that actually. So I did English A level by mistake,
Oh,
and
ache.
I was supposed to be doing sciences, but I only needed two specific topics to do computers at university. So I had a free choice on the third one, and I ended up doing English Lit. And I'd never read any Victorian novels at all. At all, except whatever they might have made us do one in GCSE. I can't really remember. But it turned out my favourite novel of the whole 2 years was The Mill on the Floss, and I wondered if you'd come across that or George Eliot at all.
I have, but I'm not massively into Georgia. I've got to be honest. Dickens is my. I just love Dickens, and you can tell by I think by my writing because I like the darker, seedier parts of Victorian life. Um, because I think that when it comes to people thinking about Victorian life, they think of it as very filled with propriety and sort of the upstairs, downstairs, and the kind of sort of women would stay at home and women wouldn't go to work and all the rest of it. And actually, it wasn't like that at all. I mean, for I think people with money, maybe women were sort of made to toe the line a lot more. But when you look at the poorer end of society, it was every man for himself. And I think
Mm.
that's lost, but in a large way for a lot of people because people do look at Victorian times and think, oh, very stuffy and boring. And it absolutely was not. So yeah, Dickens. I love Dickens just because. Well, I love some of the way he writes. Some of his sentences, Great Expectations. Some of the sentences in there have me chuckling to myself when I read. And his use of language is just fabulous. Um, but yeah, I'm trying to think back to when I was at school. I don't think we did. We did a lot of Shakespeare. I can't remember doing much
Yeah, we did.
stuff, but I went to at the Open University and did my degree there, and that was literature. And in Open University, you could very much choose your modules and put it all together, sort of thing. And I really tried to cram the classics in the sort of anything Victorian-y. I crammed that in there for sure because it's I just knew I'd enjoy it. And
Mm.
working at Bliss Hill for part of that degree as well. So I was working whilst I was studying, and I'd be sat behind the chemist counter in the old Victorian chemist shop reading these Victorian novels for my degree, and it was lovely.
Yeah, it sounds great. You're talking about Bliss Hill, which I'm not aware of, but it does sound a lot like Beamish to me. Have you been there? Yeah, yeah.
Not been
Mm.
to Beamish. I've been to a few others. I've been to Black Country Museums, a bit similar. There's Morwellum Quay down in Cornwall that I've been to. I'd love to go to Beamish. I know somebody who went from Bliss Hill and went to work at Beamish for a bit. So yeah, they're very similar places. Yeah.
Okay, so you said you've been researching Mary for 4 years,
hmm
roughly. So how did you first come across Mary?
So I was writing a book, my book, which is about to come out with Holland Press, which is going to be called "Simple Twists of Faith." Of Fate, sorry, Simple Twists of Fate. Let me get my words out. And the main character was Flora, and Flora is a completely imaginary character. And I was looking for some real aspect of history for her to interact with. Because in my first novel, The Prendergast Watch, I made it all up. It was all fictional. And I decided I wanted something real for this fictional character to interact with in this other book. And I went through, I'm a massive fan of the British newspaper archives.
Mm. Yeah, me too.
Went through the British newspaper archives just looking for something that was the right time period, set in London, something that happened. And I didn't know what I was looking for. It could have been an art exhibition, it could have been a suffrage movement, it could have been anything. And I discovered Mary, and instantly I just had to know more about her. And she became this character in this book who my main character kind of interacts with. By the time I'd finished writing that book, I'd I couldn't stop trying to find out about Mary. It was, she was the next thing I had to write about her. So I did a lot of research about her, made a scrapbook that's full of all sorts of things. Visited London a number of times, went to take pictures of different areas where she'd lived and places that she'd been to. And then I wrote my novel, which is Mary, Queen of the 40. And by the time I'd finished that, I decided that I was writing a novel and writing a nonfiction is really, really different. So I decided that the novel was lovely and it followed her life and it's very factual. But when you write a novel,
Mm.
there's certain kind of poetic licenses that you need to take in order to keep the story flowing. So anything like that in the novel, I've done a kind of fess up at the back. I've confessed at the back. This probably didn't happen. It probably happened a bit more like this. But most of that book is very factual. But by the time I'd finished writing it, I'd got so engrossed in her life that I knew I had to write a non-fiction as well and get
Mm.
everything out there and just splurge all the evidence in front of everybody and let everybody know everything. And which is, I'm 62,000 words into writing that at the moment. So I'm nearly there.
Oh,
First draft.
you're basically there. Yeah. Okay. So this is really interesting. I'm going to try and stick to the script a little bit. So we're going to move on to 1,000 Blows. So
Yeah.
people who have been reading Crime Guy will be absolutely sick of hearing about this on my Instagram, etc. But I heard about this, I'm going to say Christmas time. It could have been early December, but I don't even know how. I literally can't remember how I heard about it. And I realized it's got this boxing name,
Mm-hmm.
but equally I realized that Disney were pushing the female side of the story.
Yeah.
I would say even more, like a lot more.
Yeah.
In fact, I see Mary as being the lead character in the whole thing, actually, but that might be, we'll see what you think about that. But I heard about it about Christmas, and then I thought, oh, I've got to start mentioning this because I knew Alice was in it, although it's a very small part and a young Alice.
Yeah.
And I also know that it was Stephen Knight drama as well, which tied in, everything just tied into my book
Yeah.
at the perfect time because it had just been released. So I've been plugging it like mad, but I'm going to ask you the difficult question about how real is 1,000 Blows? What is it that, or how does it equate with your knowledge of Mary?
Not massively, if I'm honest. Um, so Mary was 1,000 Blows has kind of taken Alice Diamond and Mary and shoved them both together a little bit, and the
Mm.
chronology is very unreal in many respects. So Mary was last known as the Queen of the 40 Thieves, never called the 40 Elephants for a start. Um, Last known as the Queen of the 40 Thieves when she was arrested in 1896. Alice Diamond wasn't known as the Queen of the 40 Thieves, and she was also the 40 Thieves, wasn't she, when she was first arrested in 1915. So there's this massive time period between the two. Potentially, those women may never have met, as I would say. Massive potential for that, I think. And Mary wasn't a gun-touting, shop-robbing lady. Mary was much more subtle, much more clever, much more behind the scenes, especially towards the sort of 1890s. I mean, we know she started out as a flower girl. And she was a persistent flower girl. She was one of those annoying ones on Piccadilly that people were writing to the papers to complain about, that would persistently pursue people up and down the street to try and get a sale. But
Mm.
Mary had a lifestyle that she wanted, and she wasn't satisfied with scraping by. So she was very good at blackmail, and that was her forte. She wasn't afraid to accuse people of things and try to get money out of them. And in fact, she was very, very successful about it. But she did it in private places. So there were none of these sort of massive blow ups in the middle of public, or
Yeah.
sort of those, yeah, just no gunfire, no sort of threatening as such, other than threatening to get a policeman if somebody didn't pay up. Because what she had a number of kind of blackmail tricks that she would do. So she had the bus fare trick, which was she would approach a gentleman who was usually obviously well dressed, because she wanted him to have a lot of money, and potentially an older gentleman who might not give up such a chase or such a fight, maybe. And she would look very beautiful, very sort of demure, very kind of desperate for his help, really. And she would say she'd lost her bus fare. Oh, she'd been pickpocketed. And she would say, please, please, sir, can you help me? Can I have bus fare for me to get home? I'm really worried. I've been pickpocketed. I'm worried about the scoundrels in these streets. And charmed by her, the gentleman would say, "Oh, of course, here you go, young lady," kind of thing. And then she'd say, "Oh, please, please, will you walk me to the omnibus stop? Because I'm worried. I've already had my pockets picked. I need your protection." And so he would walk her to her omnibus stop, which actually would not be an omnibus stop at all. She'd have secreted a couple of her women in a back street out of the way. And as it was getting dark, she tended to do this as well. So off they'd go into a back street, it's getting dark. Suddenly her women would come out of the shadows and they'd all be screeching that this man had acted inappropriately, forced himself upon her, or that sort of thing. And then they would threaten to call for the constable. And so he would inevitably pay up to avoid a scandal. She had a very similar scheme where she had a lady in a house in Pimlico and she would get a gentleman to escort her back to her aunt's house. She would tell him it was her aunt's house. And then they would get there and they would be accused again of a similar thing. And in that, at one point, when she did that, it was a judge that she'd picked on, and he paid up £400 for her to stay silent. So she was raking it in from blackmail, and it was all done off the streets. It was, or in back streets. It was done much more covertly, um, and much more privately. She had another brilliant scam where she would go into a public house and she would sit by a chap to chat him up a little bit, do a bit of flirting, pick his pocket, get his lovely pocket watch, pass it back to one of her ladies, who would then go behind her and take it off to the fence. And then they'd made the money, and there was nothing on Mary. She'd got nothing in her pocket. So if she was,
Mm.
gentleman then said, "You've got it, let's frisk her," and she'd got nothing on her. And in one of these episodes, the chap that she'd just pickpocketed was so upset when he realised his watch was missing. She said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll meet you here tomorrow." He said, "I'll offer £20 to get it back." She said, "Right, okay, I'll meet you here tomorrow. I've grown up around here. I know all these naughty people in these streets. I'll get it back for you." So she left, got the watch back from the fence, brought it back the next day. He gave her £20, and then he gave her £5 extra for her trouble. So then they all went out to a theatre, and then they all spent all the rest of the money on whelks because they knew how to party. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, it was more subtle, it was more private, and it was more sort of one to one. And that's how she tended to make her money. And then towards the 1890s, there's a little bit of evidence that she turned more like a fence, or what they called a mosca, which is similar to a fence. It's basically ladies were very good at it. Younger, beautiful ladies were much more better at it than men, because what they would do is they would get the stolen goods, they would take it to a pawnbroker's. Now, some of the pawnbrokers would be in on it, and some of them wouldn't. So Moscas would tend to go to the pawnbrokers that were not in on the receipt of stolen goods. They were expecting it to be above board, and they could get away with saying, "Well, I work for Mrs. So and so round the corner, who's very rich, and she's got a little bit of a problem. She likes substances her husband doesn't know about, and she needs a little bit of ready cash to go and get her some. So, she just wants you to have these trinkets. Can we please have the cash, because you mustn't tell anybody?" And then the pawnbrokers would be, "Oh yes, oh, I know Mrs. So and so." She'd always make sure that they would have, Moscas always knew the name of somebody that they could drop to say they worked for them, so that it would all sound very legitimate, because pawnbrokers knew the big families round about. So there were different scams that they could use, and Mary was into those sorts of kind of one-to-one scams that would make her quite a lot of money on this. I mean, you think about the exchange rate. When she made that £400, she was rolling in it, absolutely rolling in it. And yeah, so the whole Thousand Blows is very, very different to Mary's actual life. And it has kind of amalgamated her massively with Alice Diamond's escapades. And we could talk about the boxing world as well, and Mary's kind of influence in, what influence the boxing world had on Mary, because boxing was a massive sport around Lambeth, around sort of the places that Mary was in. there's very little evidence that Mary had much to do with boxing at all, really.
Yeah.
The one piece of evidence that there is that the papers sort of shouted out when she was arrested in 1896. They talked about her having an association with a chap called Darky Kemp. And Darky, there were two Kemps that were arrested around that time, and the papers had said that Darky Kemp had just gone to prison for 5 years. And they'd said really that he was her lover, this Darky Kemp chap. Now, the more I look into it, the more I question whether he was her lover at all, because the chronology of her relationship with somebody else kind of overlaps there. But Darky Kemp, there were two Darky Kemps. There were two Kemps that were arrested around that time. One went down for 3 years. One went down for 5 years. The guy that went down for 3 years seems more like Mary's kind of guy in that he was more her age. He was doing petty theft, and Mary was associated with a lot of people that were into just petty theft, really. And he went down for stealing a couple of shillings from somebody's coat out of a warehouse, and sort of little things like that. The other guy that was known as Darky Kemp went down for 5 years, and this guy, he was quite a tall tale teller. He had a number of jail sentences, but he had links to the boxing world, and he's the only real bit of evidence we've got of Mary having links to the boxing world. So he used to own a commissioning agency at one point that was taking bets on boxing, and he also apparently was the manager of quite a famous boxer. I think it was Jem Mace, for a short period of time. He was a good deal older than Mary, and his the sketch in the papers of him doesn't equate with what you'd expect the beautiful young Mary Carr, vivacious, to be sort of massively sort of paramour-y with,
Mm-hmm.
be enamoured with. I suppose that's the word I'm looking for. He was quite a portly, balding, older gentleman, and he also, nobody seemed to like him because he'd got a bit of a reputation as being a bit of a grass. He'd been successful in making money in different areas, but he did have a very young wife. Now, part of the chronology here that makes me discredit him as a lover of hers is that he came out of prison in about, I think it was 1893, and she was arrested in 1896, and apparently he'd just been arrested again, which this guy had. So within 3 years, apparently he'd managed to get himself a younger wife whose family knew nothing about his criminal exploits. But in that time, Mary was meant to be shacked up with somebody else. So what I believe is that the papers, who later on in 1900 said that she was in a relationship with somebody she definitely wasn't then as well, I think they just liked that. You know what
Yeah.
newspapers are like. Oh, we'll couple them off. That'll look brilliant because he's a bit of a bad guy and she's a bit of a bad girl. Let's put them together. And that's a great story. But actually, at that point, we know for definite that Mary was in a relationship with somebody else, which I can stop waffling now for that question, and then we can get on to something else. But so, most of the things in A Thousand Blows don't tally with the Mary that
No.
we know and love. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I just let you talk through that because I think it's just very fascinating to understand just how much they've changed for this story. So if you do look back at Peaky Blinders, or I don't know whether you've seen SAS Rogue Heroes as well, so in Peaky Blinders, they don't really use any real characters. They've changed all the names except for one or two, like Billy Kimber, maybe one or two others that are very lightly disguised. In SAS Rogue Heroes, they use a lot of real names.
Yeah.
And in this, I'm aware of Mary and Alice.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming the boxer is, I'm pretty sure the boxer is somehow real.
I think the two boxers were real, but they were from about 40 years before.
So this is very loosely historical fiction, isn't it?
Very loose, yeah.
Whereas if we look at your novel, I know there's like at least three different strands to it.
Mm-hmm.
From what you said earlier, yours is pretty much all real, apart from the one or two things that you've admitted to at the end.
Yeah.
And I think they're both okay. And what I said recently in some post, or I don't know what I was posting, whether it's Instagram or not, was that I feel like I know Mary and Alice, and I know Alice a lot better.
Yeah.
I think most people do. You said earlier about the Victorian period being very recent. Well, Alice was
Yeah.
not Victorian, was she? Yeah,
Yeah.
she lived into the 1950s,
She did. Yeah.
and you can trace her through Shirley Pitts to the 90s
Yeah.
and right up to the present day. So I feel like Alice is very recent. Mary does feel a bit more distant to me,
Mm.
but I just wonder whether it's okay that they've made all this stuff up, because it's not too far away from how I see Mary and Alice in my mind. And I haven't researched them in the detail you have. I just know the bits and bobs. So Brian MacDonald wrote a really good book about Alice.
Yeah.
Um, I think he can connect.
Yeah, I've got that book.
Yeah, he can connect her to his family.
Yeah.
And people who have read my book will know all about Brian and his relatives.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really in two minds about this, because I think they've captured the spirit of the period. Would it be better if they'd not called her Mary Carr? Maybe. But at least people see how exciting this time period was,
Yeah.
even if it is massively exaggerated.
I think Mary Carr was a legend. She deserves to be a legend. I think they're almost hyping up her legend to so much that people might be a bit disappointed when they find out what her real history was like. Maybe.
Yes.
She's very glamorous, but I do think that she would love to, if you could say, hey, Mary Carr, look what they've done, I think
Yeah,
you go, that is cool.
I do.
I think she was the sort of lady that would have really absolutely just loved it and thought it was wonderful. And it's brought her name to our lips. And when
Yes.
I started to research her, I knew nobody knew about her. I mean, I'd got the Brian MacDonald book, and he was and Caitlin Davis, and I got that Queens of the Underworld, and they were the only books that I could find with just a bit about her in. And I thought then, this woman needs her life story needs telling. People need to know about her, because she's got lots of layers. And when you start to get to know her and know what she did for other people, because she was quite philanthropist, she was doing lots of kind of good for people that were in that poverty-stricken place that she kind of frequented. And she cared a lot about children and about the children of the streets. And so I think it's wonderful that her name's being spoken again, and A Thousand Blows has definitely done that, just in a very explosive and modern way, I guess.
Yeah.
And for a modern audience,
Yeah,
that gets people hooked, doesn't it?
it does. I mean, the only comment or regret I would have there is that the reason I liked the female gangsters is because they didn't stab each other and try shoot each other and wave guns around.
Yeah.
And of course, that is exactly what the temptation to make Mary do that was obviously too great.
Yeah. Yeah. I think they wanted it to be explosive, clearly, didn't they? But you're right, Mary. There's no evidence ever. I've got no evidence whatsoever of Mary handling a gun ever. Nor stabbing people. No physical violence from Mary. From people that she knew. Minnie Duggan, who came after her, was quite a crazed and violent girl that would beat up people. But Mary Carr herself didn't really, I've got no evidence that she set her hands on people. I've got evidence that she got other people to beat somebody up for her. But I've got no evidence that she herself would get her hands dirty in that way whatsoever.
That's how I would imagine it. I see her as the kind of the godfather figure who doesn't really do anything unsavory, but has the means to arrange it.
Yeah, definitely.
So we need to move on to Mary as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm working my way into this without, in the most delicate way possible. So Mary's played by Erin Doherty in the series.
Yeah.
Who is, as you say here, a beauty, no doubt about it. But what I didn't know until, I'm going to say last week, when another friend of mine who's been on the podcast recently, Nafisa, she said, have you seen this painting of Mary Carr? And I'm like, no, I've never seen a picture of Mary Carr. There are no photographs. I'm very surprised there's a painting,
Hmm.
and we sort of went through some bits and pieces, and I think me and you ended up chatting on Saturday night because I still I still don't believe it's Mary Carr. But so what? Just to rewind a little bit,
Yeah.
um, we're suggesting here that Mary was a model
Mm.
for at least one famous painter, maybe more than one.
Probably two.
You might be able to
Hmm.
tell us the names in a second. So, how did she get from being this flower seller, blackmailer,
Hmm.
to be noticed by really serious artists? These are RA, Royal Academy members.
Yeah. So in 1904, a model wrote a newspaper report about what it was like to be an artist model, and she actually recounted the legend of Mary Carr getting picked up by Frederick Leighton, who was Royal Academy, incredible artist. And it was while she was a flower girl. Now, artists love flower girls. Artists had this vision of flower girls as being this bucolic, wondrous, kind of pure, um, these girls of the street, but who came from the countryside inexplicably with their flowers and all the rest of it. And of course, that was absolutely untrue. But Mary was beautiful. And she was on Piccadilly Circus around that area with her basket of flowers, and Frederick Leighton turned up in his brougham or whatever he was, hackney cab. Probably not. That's too cheap for Frederick Leighton. But he pulled up and he just basically saw her and decided that she was beautiful and asked her to come and model for him. And this report in 1904 talked about her having violet eyes and glorious hair. Um, Now, I've got a theory that Mary was fairly similar in hair colour, and sort of maybe skin colour and sort of outlook as Dorothy Dean, which was Frederick Leighton's muse. And Dorothy Dean had a number of sisters, and Leighton painted the sisters, but he was very, very set on painting Dorothy a lot. Um, and around the time that he painted Mary, or would have painted Mary, there are three paintings that kind of fit that time period. Um, in that newspaper report that I keep going back to from 1904, this woman that wrote it says that the Bath of Psyche was Mary, which I don't know if you've seen it. It's a very kind of long painting. It's a semi-naked lady, very Grecian, but it's clearly Dorothy Dean's head on those shoulders. But around the time that that was painted, Dorothy Dean, because she was an actress, she was off in America doing stuff. And so it's possible that Mary was a body double, and that he got because Frederick Leighton had a particular way of painting. He always started off with chalk sketches on brown paper, and he would build up the sort of layers and how he liked it on those, and everything started with that. And a lot of these kind of initial sketches didn't have heads on them. So Mary
Ah,
very well have been one of these kind of body sketches. She could have contributed to the painting itself, and then Dorothy Dean's head got stuck on the top, because Dorothy Dean's head was on a lot of paintings. And if you take another one of his paintings from the time period, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Captive Andromache, but I'm not convinced that I say that right. However, it's this Greek sort of legend, and it's a painting very full of people, lots and lots of figures. Some of them are carrying huge pots, and you can see Dorothy Dean at least twice in that painting if you know what to look for. But it's possible, time period wise, that Mary modelled for one of those figures as well. Um, but a lot of people believe that the maid with the golden hair is Mary. And this is a completely different picture. It's not Grecian, it's not kind of ancient kind of time period. It's basically a girl sitting reading a book. And that's definitely not Dorothy Dean. So that face is longer, it's longer in the nose, it's very, very much different. Um, and actually, the newspapers, we've got two newspaper sketches of Mary as well that we can kind of link to and try and kind of identify from. And not only that, we've got artwork by Dorothy Tennant as well. So Dorothy Tennant was an artist. She was a very famous artist again. And allegedly Mary modelled for her too. and Dorothy Tennant did a book called London Street Arabs. And in London Street Arabs, there's a sketch of a flower girl, which some people believe might be Mary. Um, it's it's a little bit more cartoony compared. It's not like Frederick Leighton's work. This particular sketch, although others of her paintings are very beautiful and beautifully done. However, that sketch in London Street Arabs does look a little bit like a picture of Mary in the Penny Illustrated News. I think it was in about 1906. 1896. Similar sort of largish eyes, kind of sort of hair drawn up, little slightly bud mouth. But then we've also got one in the London Evening Standard. I think it was in 1896 again on that arrest of Mary, which totally kind of throws those kind of pretty little pictures out of the window, because in this one she's got quite a long face and quite a long chin. And
Mm.
look at that picture and then you look at the maid with the golden hair, actually they tally a little bit. None of them have got the hairy mole on her right cheek that are in her prison records. But maybe the artists didn't want to put that in. But yeah, so she's quite elusive. And Dorothy Tennant also did a set of paintings of kind of nude women on a beach. Potentially some of those might be Mary as well, because that was around the same time period. So, but you can't see faces; it's all their backs to you, and it's just hair. And Mary had that glorious hair, of course, and Dorothy Tennant might have enjoyed painting that glorious hair. And the artists would have talked about models. If they had a good model, they would put them forward. When Mary was arrested in 1896, one of her friends who came and kind of testified about her character said that she modelled for an artist called Arthur Small. I can't find an artist called Arthur Small, but Mary lived only just round the corner from an art school. So potentially she could be modelling at the art school as well. And at that time, she was making some quite serious money, potentially fencing and things like that. But and artist models, they earned quite a pittance.
Yes.
But was it a vanity thing a little bit? Maybe, who knows? Yeah, I suppose.
Well,
Again, she was a legend. She was getting down on canvas, and she would live forever on canvas. Then that's pretty cool as well.
it is. I mean, lucky for us, because there seemed to be no cameras near her at the time.
No.
So there's almost too many things to talk about there. I do find it a little bit surprising, based on what you've been saying of Mary and what little I knew of her before this conversation, that she could do both of these things. And I know all people have more than one thing they do or one way they are.
Yeah.
Maybe even more so in the creative arts and writing and performing and so on. But she is a very successful blackmailer.
Mm-hmm.
We can say that, non-violent,
Mm-hmm.
and basically an artist's muse for some really top-end painters. In fact, my family members, my wife's family, are going to see Frederick Leighton in a couple of weeks. I believe his museum's in Holland Park.
Yes, I went
And
a few weeks ago. Yeah, it's
so
fantastic. And if she sees some little chalk drawings on a desk, I stood there and got the chills, and I thought that could be Mary. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know very much about painting. I don't know whether you've learnt about this through this research or whether you already knew this, but this notion that a drawing would take weeks or months is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
We know that maybe he could have taken simple photographs, but they would have been terrible resolution. So you had to do it from life. You couldn't just take a few snaps and then just finish it off whenever you wanted. So I should imagine any great muse would get bored. So you're saying he actually used several bodies for each picture, or for some pictures. So they do the body without the head,
mm-hmm.
and then later on a head might be added.
Yes. So his initial sketches, a lot of them don't have heads on. But thinking about her as a muse, I think Dorothy Dean was his muse. Mary was probably more like Staff. Mary probably didn't go in through the front door and be treated particularly well. Frederick Leighton had a back stairway that was very narrow that led up to his artist studio, so that the models could get up there without having to walk through his house. And potentially that's how Mary would have got up there. Um, there's this little door that kind of comes out just underneath the other side of his minstrel's gallery, and it comes out into his studio. And so she wouldn't have been considered massively important, and
Mm.
models weren't considered massively important, um, unless they were, like Dorothy Dean, massively treasured by the artist. And we've got no evidence to show that Mary was that treasured. That she was being painted, but how much they valued her is questionable.
Mm.
Because I think if they had valued her, we'd know which painting she was in.
Well, yes, I'm thinking these days about film and TV credits. You know, everybody who made a cup of tea gets on the credits. And we don't have these for ancient pictures. Not that ancient actually, but old pictures.
Mm.
But I wonder what Mary's job title would have been on the credits for those pictures. So let's move on a little bit. Um, let's talk about romance.
Okay.
So you've mentioned a couple of relationships that Mary may or may not have had, and one or two that you definitely know she did have.
Mm-hmm.
But how is this dealt with in your novel?
So the first relationship we know of that's a concrete thing is her wedding. So she married Thomas Crane in 1888, and he was a commissioning agent at the races, and they lived together. On their marriage certificate, they put that they were living in Buckingham Street, which is just off Charing Cross, um, just off the Strand. So potentially we know Mary lied about her age, so um, I believe that she lied on her wedding certificate and that she lied about her age to get married without parental consent. So on her wedding certificate, she was 21. He's about 5, 6 years older than her. But I don't think that she was 21 on
Mm,
wedding certificate. It's really hard with Mary because she lied about her age to know. Um, well, we say she lied about her age. The only bit of evidence we have that she possibly did was a newspaper, and again a newspaper report, and we know that sometimes these can be made up. Later in her life, that led she was born in the 1860s, but she always put on her prison records that she was born in 1871, um, which would have made her younger than 21 when she got married. But um, it didn't last very long. So this relationship with her husband didn't last very long, possibly for any number of reasons, really. But I know for a fact that probably a year after they were married, there was no sign of them at the place that they'd said on their marriage certificate was going to be their marital home, and they weren't there. So where did they go? What happened? I don't know. But she got arrested in 1890 anyway, and went to prison for a bit. By the time
mm,
she came out, there's no evidence that she and her husband were together at that point. But Mary grew up in these streets where marriage wasn't necessarily the norm. So, working on the streets, working as a flower seller, working as a street seller, Mary would have been used to people just, as they called it, living in sin. Um, Women would just move in with men. They'd take on their surnames, not without getting married. They just call them by themselves by the chap's surname, and then once they'd had enough of each other, they'd just move on, and they'd go and pick up the surname of the next chap that they were with. And Minnie Duggan, who came after Mary as the next queen of the 40s, she did that a lot. Um, Mary tended to kind of stick to her. Well, Mary kind of told people different names as well at different points, but on her first arrest, she called herself Eva Jackson, for example. But yeah, Mary, after her wedding and that kind of not panning out for very long, um, we've got then Mary was allegedly with somebody called Dare, and the only thing that we know about Dare was that he got arrested for hotel robberies, and I can't find anybody who got arrested for hotel robberies called Dare. However, the newspapers are adamant that this guy existed. There's no reason why he didn't exist. I can't find any evidence about why he might not have existed. So apparently when he was arrested, he left her with a massive diamond necklace, and she went over to Antwerp to sell it. um, which I think she would have needed a bit of help for, because
Mm.
no, I wouldn't know how to do that as a modern person. I wouldn't know how to go over to Antwerp and flog a diamond necklace. So, I can Google how to do that on the internet if I need to. But how would Mary have known that? So she would have needed a bit of help to do that. So in the book, I kind of try to explain how she might have done that. Um, and also, another interesting thing about Mary is that she never had any children that we know of. Um, and why that is, I can't say, because she absolutely loved children. She really did love children. Um, so after Dare, then we have her. Um, we've got this alleged romance that I've already spoken about, that was with a chap called Darky Kemp, supposedly, according to the newspapers. However, we do know that Mary was shacked up with a chap called Alfred Gorman for a while before her arrest in 1896. Now, some modern accounts have got her shacked up with Albert Gorman rather than Alfred Gorman, but they were two different people. Um, and they were probably brothers. We can find a family where there are these two brothers, Alfred and Albert, of the right age. They were both naughty boys. Albert was known as the king of the rampers, and he did lots of things like um, kind of placing bets at the races with invisible ink, and then it would all kind of evaporate, and then he would have won earlier in the day, and he'd get lots of money doing things like that. And Alfred was a petty thief who was in and out of prison constantly from a very young age, probably from the age of probably 16 onwards. He was in and out of prison. And it was him really that she was in a relationship with when the papers started saying that she was with this Darky Kemp guy. And we know she was definitely with him because when she stood in court at the Old Bailey, Alfred Gorman had been ferried in and sat on the front row amongst all the people giving evidence, just so that she could have him there in front of her. And whether he tricked his way in or whether she asked for him to be brought in, because that was a possibility, she might have paid somebody to get him in, so that they could kind of be close to each other just in case it all went pear shaped, which it did. Then yeah, so that's her relationship with him is one of the things that makes me question the Darky Kemp thing. So when I wrote the novel, um, because Mary would have had a number of lovers, she wouldn't have just been with Thomas Crane and then not been with anybody else up until whenever. I've kind of let her have every single one of these lovers, just to kind of sort of demonstrate that actually she wasn't kind of shackled by that kind of Victorian ideal. Well, she got married and then that was it, kind of thing, and then she settled down with Alfred Gorman, and it wasn't like that at all. So, um, yeah, so that's a little bit of extra in the book, and in the back of the book, I kind of talk over that and talk about, actually, you know, this sort of the evidence of what was really there. But then, so once she'd been to prison on that occasion and she came out, she was then up in court in 1900, and this is the reason I think that she wasn't with Darky Kemp. They paired her up with Charles Harvey, who she was arrested with in 1900, and they called them a good-looking couple, and they called them a couple, but actually Mary was arrested while she was hanging around with his wife. So she definitely
Mm.
wasn't a couple with him, but because they were two good-looking thieves or whatever they called them in the papers, again, it was a great story. Well, they say they're a couple. It looks brilliant in the papers. But she was sitting in the flat with his wife when she got arrested, so that was not true. So yeah, she did have like this an interesting love life. She once declared that she would never go out with a man unless he'd seen the inside of a cell. Um,
That's very interesting, isn't it?
yeah. But that was the lifestyle that she lived in. And when you really look, and writing the non-fiction book has really given me an opportunity to get to know the people around her more, and this kind of social structure of everything around her, and where she lived, and what were her neighbours doing, and what was happening. Um, and she lived on a street that was full of brothels and full of very dodgy goings on. And all of that would have been completely normal to her. She wasn't sort of this morally kind of above everybody character. And in fact, one of the newspapers suggested that her house in Stamford Street, which was the headquarters of the 40 Thieves. There, one of the newspapers has suggested it was a brothel, and I hated that idea when I first read it, and I thought, no, Mary Carr wouldn't do that. Mary Carr was a fence. Mary Carr was this. Mary Carr was that. But there were brothels all up that street, and the people that she hung out with, the people she went to the races with, owned brothels, and so it's what even if it wasn't a brothel, the girls that lived there may well have brought gentlemen back, and they may have brought gentlemen back for that kind of work, and actually Mary might have turned a blind eye to it. Who knows? I think back then it was so normal in that sort of sphere that she lived in that actually I don't think she would have batted an eyelid at her girls bringing back gentlemen for an hour or so or whatever to make it a bit of cash, because that's all it was to those girls. It was a bit of cash.
Yeah. So I'm going to just have two more questions.
Okay.
Because we've blown through our time budget as usual.
Yeah.
Well, I say as usual, it's the first time we've spoken, but everybody I ask about these characters wants to talk all day about them. So I'll finish with a question about the nonfiction book, because I think that's really important. And that's the bit that I think led me to get in touch with you in the first place. But this thing about, you mentioned this right at the beginning about the Victorian period.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, unfortunately, that the vast majority of books that we read about this time period, thinking like Jane Austen and not Dickens so much, but Dickens as well, books like Pride and Prejudice, they're all about the upper classes.
Yeah.
And they're people in there, men and women, are preoccupied with who they're marrying, who they're not marrying, and what calamity might befall them if they marry the wrong person, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They very seldom talk about the working classes, which is what evidently Mary would fall into. And it may even be that some of these female gangsters and the men were not even working class in some cases. They were fighting for survival in some cases.
Yeah.
But Victorian society seems to have this total contradiction, dichotomy between the classes. I don't know if we have that now. It's too late in the evening for me to even think about whether this relates to the modern day or not. But what you were talking about there with Stamford Street and the brothels and the loose morals and so on reminded me a lot of some of my research in the Dublin tenements. So my book goes all around the UK and the island. And there, the girls who worked in the brothels, there's a word, I'll have to put it in the notes. There's a different word that they use in Ireland, which is really nice. But they were really friendly, community, society type women who would look after each other, look after the children in the area. They'd give them shoes and this kind of stuff because they got a lot of cash coming through at certain times. It's not I'm going to say exciting. It's not the kind of thrilling, exciting image that you would take away. But I also have to mention my other passion at the moment, Dope Girls. Have you seen Dope Girls?
I've not seen it yet.
Well, you're in for a treat. So I got hold of that because one of my other women is Kate Mayrick. And I heard that the Kate in that is based very loosely on Kate Mayrick. And when you go into that, you realise that the three main women in Dope Girls are based on three real women, but very loosely. And they have a different perspective on this because they were running nightclubs. So they were business women.
Yeah.
They were not rich or upper class. Somehow, Kate Mayrick inherited some money, but it took a long, long time. She was penniless since the minute she arrived in London. She got divorced very soon after arriving in London and had a lot of children. And then she, through necessity, had to start a business. She had no other option. But if you put all of this stuff together, I feel like the working class women and working class men are massively more interesting than the society types that we read all about and I think people associate with the Victorian novel. So let's just finish on the novel and then we'll go on to your nonfiction book. But where does your novel fit into this? Are all of your characters working class?
Yeah. So At one point, Mary met Prince Albert. So you know Queen Victoria's naughty son, who later became king. I like to call him Bertie. So
Bertie.
he's in it, and he allegedly met Mary at Romano's on the Strand. So on the Strand there was this. It was like a bohemian cafe. Started out as a cafe, got bigger in the end. Um, and lots of actors and people went there. Now, Bertie loved it there. Bertie allegedly used to sit inside. There was a balcony so he could look down at the dance floor and see the dancing ladies, because we know he liked the ladies. Um, and allegedly, Mary went in there one day and Bertie was there and he proposed to her. Now, he was already married, so he was obviously just sort of on the pull, as Bertie was often on the pull. And he proposed to her, and of course she did not accept. But apparently, when she left, his pockets were a lot lighter, and she'd cleared him out of sovereigns. So he's in there, and he's not working class.
No,
And
I hope not.
Leighton, of course, and Dorothy Tennant. But obviously, Mary and her world was very working class and really, really poverty stricken. So Mary would find, as you said, with the ladies that you've looked at, that sense of community was everything. That sense of community was survival for many, many people. And Mary was brilliant at that. Mary was brilliant at creating this community of people who actually relied on her quite a lot. She would find little children in the street and bring them back and give them money and give them food. She used to go to a place called the Free Food Mission, which was a mission that was opened up for 300 kids would come in, have soup and bread. And she went there. She actually took a reporter there once with her. And whilst they were there, a little boy got caught stealing an extra piece of bread, and it turned out he'd got a brother at home with a broken leg. And Mary upended her purse into the hands of one of the people working there and said, "Make sure these poor wretches never starve." And she went back with this boy and this reporter back to this boy's house, and she kind of looked after their family and gave them money and stuff like that. And that was what she was like. And she would pay bail for her, sort of ladies that got caught. And she would also look out for the families of those in the streets around her. So if the breadwinner or bread stealer, if you like, had gone to prison, and the family was struggling, she would give the family money, especially if there was a child involved. So allegedly there was one bloke, I think he was in Holloway, and his daughter had an accident, and he was pacing and he was very, very, very upset. And when he heard that Mary Carr was looking out for his daughter, he said, "Oh, I can relax now because it's like she's got two mothers." So Mary was loved by the people around her. So she may have been sort of very naughty in many, many respects, but it was the norm. That was the norm of her world. And actually, she was very kind in many ways as well, and looked after the people around her. Um, and I try to put that across in the novel as much as possible. Obviously, I'm quite a fanatic of Mary Carr, and I'm very, very interested in her, and I'm very fond of her because I've spent 4 years looking at her. But she's almost like a Robin Hood figure. She robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. And
Mm.
that's how I kind of see her, especially when it comes to those poor families that she was helping out, because there was clearly a lot of good feeling towards her from people who had been incredibly in need.
Yeah.
I do try
Yeah.
to put that across in the novel.
Yeah, that's exactly my conclusion, actually. And throughout some of this, I've been thinking of good old Robin Hood. I think he's the one we all talk about. But what we'll come on to your nonfiction book in a second, because that's where I started with these people as well. I was thinking that that the phrase that's come up in a lot of recent conversations is working class heroes,
Mm.
and some people say, well, actually, were they heroes because they were criminals? But when you look at, I know Kate a lot better. You look at Kate Merrick, and you look at the people who ran these nightclubs. They were massively successful. They made a lot of money. She had several clubs. One of them was the 43, which is still a name that's used in the nightclub industry now. Massive, just enormously successful. Hollywood stars would flock to these nightclubs, then have a great time. But actually, it wasn't possible for these clubs to be profitable if you followed the law. The law said that you had to lock up at 10 o'clock and stop selling booze. And the only reason they were there was to sell booze and maybe one or two other things.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole system forced them to break the law. If you wanted nightclubs at all, you had to have illegal nightclubs.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether Mary's a bit like this, where it's they're driven to crime because they have to survive.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that, I think.
Mm.
And perhaps Mary's picked the least offensive crime she could possibly find, which is almost a victimless crime because she's basically blackmailing extremely wealthy men.
Yeah.
There's a massive power imbalance, but she's found a way to spin that in her favor, which I can only describe as heroic.
Mm.
I don't know whether do you
I
do you think there's any drawbacks or badness in Mary? I think she's absolutely brilliant.
I think she's brilliant. I know I'm biased, but in the book, I do try and put across the poverty that she saw, and in my non-fiction book even more so because I can explore that in more kind of factual detail. And when you look into the poverty that was in these streets and the way that people lived and how people scraped to try and get fourpence so that they could spend a night in a common lodging house, otherwise they were sleeping on the streets. And when you look into the homeless people sleeping in Trafalgar and you look at the homeless people sleeping under Waterloo Bridge and you think
Mm,
about the consequences of poverty back then. I mean, it's almost unimaginable. It's mind-boggling to think that people just had nothing, had no possessions. They had nowhere that was a home. They had nothing. And Mary saw this on a regular basis, and to live in a place that's so close to palaces and yet
mm,
surrounded by kids dying on the street of hunger. How do you exist in that
mm.
world? And Mary had money at times, and Mary made sure that people benefited from that. And I absolutely agree with you that the crimes that she committed, she was taking from people who could afford to be taken from.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
she targeted people who clearly had money. There's no point in targeting people who didn't. Let's face it. She,
Not a good business model.
yeah, she did target people who looked affluent, and they're not going to starve to death because she's nicked their pocket watch.
Yeah.
Whereas the people that she then buys bread for, or the kid that now gets some boots, or that the people at the free food mission when she empties her purse and makes a massive donation, she has a moral side to her. She's got
Mm.
a side to her that I absolutely respect, and you know hopefully that comes across in the book. It certainly will in the novel. I'm trying to be a little bit less biased in the non-fiction and trying to put the evidence forward, but I am biased because I think you're totally right. There was this community, and without this community of people helping each other, then the alternative was starve to death, freeze to death.
Yeah,
Yeah,
not a great choice. But I think also the just to finish this bit, and then we'll ask you about your non-fiction book. The women had, and I don't think the men did this, but the women basically had social security. I don't know if you came across this, where they would put aside a certain percentage of what they nicked
yeah,
for a rainy day to look after each other through maternity leave, sickness, which is absolutely just ridiculous to think that they thought of that. Even they almost invented it, as far as if you look at the time frame that we're talking about, it was a long before national insurance.
hmm yeah. There were some other gangs that did it as well. I've read about was it the Velvet Cap gang that used to give twopence a week, and then they would have a little bit of money to fall back on for bail and stuff. But yeah, Mary certainly operated like that. There's no evidence that anybody that came, well, Minnie Duggan that came after her and Helen Sheen that came after her, there's no evidence that they did that sort of thing. So Mary,
Interesting.
this kind of organised way about her. She was a business
Mm.
lady,
Yeah,
basically, and she was looking after her own. And you've got to admire her for that. In a time when you know she would have scraped by in the beginnings, and then she kind of flew. Um, yeah, she was just fab, and yeah,
that comes across really clearly, and I hope that people will read the novel. I have to say it's more than a novel, if that's the right way to describe it, isn't it? It's very heavily researched, and you've said already that you're carrying on that research. And you also said that you're 62,000 words in, which I know that's in the first draft, and you probably I lose about at least 10%, maybe 15 or 20% sometimes.
yeah,
So you do have a bit more work to do.
yeah.
But it sounds like you need that. And I know that Pen and Sword and all publishers take ages to get books out. So you'll probably finish it in the summer, will you?
Um, I'm hoping to get the first draft. I've got lots of notes, you see. I've got lots of things that I'm working on, and I work quite fast to get the first draft down. So we're talking about a publishing date for March next year. That's what we're looking at for publishing. Um, so yeah, we'll see how that goes. I'm hoping to hit all my deadlines. So I just got to get some permissions for pictures, all that sort
Oh,
of tidying up. But yeah, we're looking at March maybe next year for publication.
you've suddenly gone very kind of quiet and reticent talking about that. So you're a little bit nervous about getting the non-fiction book finished. I have to say that the photograph permissions were the thing that scared me the most.
Really scary.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it's
who knew?
copyright, and in a novel, I've not got any issues with copyright in my novel because I can, there was I've written one novel that I was a bit worried about copyright because I was having to talk about somebody in an asylum, and I had to. What I did was before I got the asylum records, which I'd signed a thing to say I would not write about. This is not the Mary Carr novel. This is another one, but this just illustrates this. I wrote a massive list of things that I predicted would be in the notes the night before and made sure I'd emailed it to myself. So it's all dated, so I could use any of those things in my book. And then when the asylum
Mm,
came through and they kind of backed up what I'd kind of guessed anyway, I knew I hadn't breached any copyright because I'd already guessed all that stuff anyway, and that was going in the novel. And
yeah,
but generally in a novel, you don't have that fear of copyright, do you? Because
no.
you're not quoting anybody or anything, or you're not using a photograph that belongs to somebody else potentially, or so that the non-fiction is a bit scarier because you've got all that sort of worry of treading on people's toes a little bit as well, haven't you?
Yes, you do. We could talk about that for another hour, but the fact that I sort of liked working in the 1920s and 30s because I knew that everybody was dead
Yeah.
and their children were dead,
Hmm.
and probably their children were pretty much close to being dead as well. And I thought, what are the chances of me annoying anybody?
Yeah.
And when my editor picked the manuscript up, he said, "You've written about this guy called Dockegg in Ireland." And I said, "This is a nickname for this gangster." And I said, "Yeah, that's right." He goes, "Well, Dockegg still lives. The name lives on. And in 2016, he did something very, very naughty indeed." And I do think how brave I am. I may or may not put this in the notes, but I was absolutely stunned. This guy had connected it all up, and it just shows you can't be too careful.
Yeah, you've got to be careful. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Luckily for me, because I've written about a couple of other women as well, but they're more local to me. And every woman I seem to have written about has never had a child, so
interesting.
direct descendants to kind of come after me.
Yeah,
So yeah, luckily for me, I just so happen to have written about women that haven't had children.
cool. So thanks, Emma, for chatting this evening. We've gone on. We'll set aside half an hour. It's a long time after the hour now, but thanks for being so patient and so forthcoming on the answers. And I'm hoping that people will find this as fascinating as I have. And I think we could have talked for at least another hour. Maybe again, we can talk in future. Maybe when the book finally comes out next March.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're talking about another full year before that comes out. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Have you got anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's been
All good?
really lovely talking to someone who knows Mary and just kind of has an idea about the background and just being able to have that back and forth. And I know it's kind of been a bit of a monologue for me, really, just sort of waffling about her. But it's been lovely. So thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. And I need to talking to the BBC on Friday, aren't you? So it's good practice for that.